Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 5 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average are allowing the most fantasy points to opposing running backs so we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. After which, I'll mention my top 36 ranked running backs, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual running back, and then also presenting statistics that justify their current ranking. A couple things to remind you guys of. First and foremost, rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday, there's going to be a lot of injury information that is made public that could very easily adjust these overall rankings, whether it's running backs themselves with their injuries and or offensive linemen, quarterbacks, all of the variables that could potentially affect their upside and or downside within a given week. So keep that in mind. Additionally, all statistics that I mentioned are for a half PPR, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. There are timestamps down in the description of the video for those of you who are looking for a specific player. While you're down there, again, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you guys win a fantasy football championship. So whether it's later tonight's live stream, tomorrow's wide receiver rankings video, Thursday's quarterback and tight ends, Friday's rest of season strength of schedule, Saturday live stream, Sunday morning live stream starting at 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, because again, there's another London game this upcoming Sunday. I'll be live streaming for 4 hours on Sunday morning with updated rankings so that we are all set to go for week 5. So if you have not yet already, help us achieve our goal of 80,000 subscribers by subscribing today. I greatly appreciate the support. And of course, be sure to join us later tonight for our live stream. I'll be answering some waiver wire questions, trade questions, etc. in order to help you guys out. Outside of that, the final thing I wanted to remind you of while you're down in the description, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my rankings every single Sunday morning, if you go ahead, travel over to Underdog Fantasy, not only will you have the opportunity of potentially drafting, putting together some teams, and or pick 'em slips for this upcoming weekend, you can go ahead, sign up, make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, and get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, with flex rankings, all encompassing so that you can help yourself out for the remainder of the season. On top of it, when you make that first-time deposit, you get a first-time deposit match, and you get a mystery pick'em player to put together within a slip. All of that together, all you got to do is travel to the link down in the description and sign up and make a first-time deposit today. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, of course, check out the map to the right side of the screen and draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. All right. Let's talk about the running back position, beginning with matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, I have isolated running back rushing statistics allowed by all defenses in the National Football League thus far this season from weeks 1 through 4. And the reason why I obviously go ahead and isolate running back rushing statistics, like I've mentioned over the years, is because of the data that I've collected over the last 3 seasons. Receiving upside from running backs are primarily of the responsibility of the team's offensive coordinator and quarterbacks getting their running backs heavily involved. Very seldom do we ever see matchups give overall upside for a running back in the receiving game. Therefore, we isolate running back rushing statistics to make sure that we have the overall idea as to whether or not matchups really do play a factor, and they certainly do. As we know, of course, the Denver Broncos for another consecutive week are giving the most points to opposing running backs thus far this season. The huge efforts of the Miami Dolphins running backs certainly leave them at the top of this conversation, but it wasn't absent this last week as Khalil Herbert has another great game. Hopefully, Breece Hall can have his bounce back game this season and really catch a stride in week 5 in a nice little kind of revenge game against that organization. The Carolina Panthers, New York Giants, Green Bay Packers, Miami Dolphins, these teams are all giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated. So we want to take advantage of this, and I will refer back to this, but on the other end of the spectrum, we have the more difficult matchups, ones that we at times want to kind of avoid. But in some of these circumstances, we can't avoid them. We're not going to bench Kyren Williams taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. Kyren Williams obviously has played out of his mind thus far this season, and even though he's going up against the most difficult matchup at the running back position, as the Philadelphia Eagles have only allowed a 2.89 yard per carry average to opposing running backs this season, and only 6.13 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics per game average. Overall, again, we know these matchups are difficult. The Detroit Lions, the Tennessee Titans, the 49ers, these teams have played very well in terms of stopping the run, not only this year, but even last year. And going forward, even though they're difficult matchups, a lot of these scenarios is just a matter of, are we on the fringe of this running back? And can this variable perhaps give us more potential confidence and or give us more insight as to whether or not we should be starting our running backs in the given week. Outside of that, let's go ahead and now let's talk about my top 36 running back rankings. Beginning with our number 1, we have Christian McCaffrey. As you guys can see on the bottom of the screen, we have next gen stats available, running back rushing attempts from this last week. So of course, Christian McCaffrey had himself 20 rushing attempts. That pretty much displays all of his rushing attempts and the yardage that he gained from every single attempt, just so we're all on the same page as to how effective he was with his overall opportunities. Obviously, as we can see, he scored 3 touchdowns, but as a total, 4 touchdowns is no joke, but it really isn't a surprise. Christian McCaffrey is the best. I know he's coming off of a 45-point week, but he's capable of doing things like this. Coming off a week where he had 7 catches, 71 yards, and a receiving touchdown. He is the San Francisco 49ers offense. And of course, with Deebo Samuel dealing with a little bit of an injury last week, they continue to double down in allowing Christian McCaffrey to carry this team against the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, you're starting him. He's had 12 consecutive games of at least 1 rushing touchdown when he is playing majority of the overall offensive snaps, over 50%. He's had 10 out of the last 12 games consist of 100 or more total yards as his overall contribution. Obviously, his weeks 1 through 4 contributions to our fantasy teams has been incredible. He's put up 111 half PPR fantasy points from weeks 1 through 4. The only other running back in the last decade who has had more fantasy points in the first 4 weeks of a season has been Alvin Kamara. Again, Christian McCaffrey is on an unbelievable pace, and hopefully he'll continue going into the given week. Derrick Henry is our number 2. Again, we're going to leave Christian McCaffrey in the S tier because really no one can catch him. But Derrick Henry obviously made himself an argument to potentially get into the conversation if he can maintain some consistency in the coming weeks. Obviously, he's had a couple dud performances this year, but ultimately, Derrick Henry's been able to get the job done. This upcoming week, he takes on the Indianapolis Colts. It is of course, division rival. And every time Derrick Henry takes on this team, my goodness, does he have himself incredible games. Specifically, week 4 of the 2022 season, 22 carries for 114 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 catches for 33, 22.2 fantasy points. Week 7 of last year against Indianapolis, 30 rushing attempts for 128, 3 catches for 10 yards, 15.3 fantasy points. In 6 out of the last 7 games that Derrick Henry's played against the Indianapolis Colts, he has surpassed 100 or more rushing yards. The only one game in which he wasn't able to do so was the game in which he, in 2021, injured his foot and was out for the remainder of the year in that overall season. Therefore, I'm expecting Derrick Henry to have himself a lot of success. Last week, he achieved his 4th career passing touchdown. If he's able to do stuff like that, my goodness, I don't care what Tyjae Spears is doing in terms of his overall contributions. Derrick Henry is going to be a fantastic play in the given week. Number 3, we have Bijan Robinson. Of course, Bijan Robinson is a part of an offense that is obviously struggling with Desmond Ridder. But regardless of that overall situation, Bijan Robinson is able to succeed nonetheless. Coming off of a week in which he had 16 fantasy points, regardless of the fact that he didn't even score a touchdown. That is very, very rare in terms of the fantasy football landscape. Therefore, if we're going to continue to see him succeed, whether it's on the ground or through the air, taking on the Houston Texans, the Texans are allowing 16.38 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated, on top of the fact that they're allowing over 4 yards per carry on average. Bijan Robinson should be able to succeed, to say the very least. On top of the fact that Tyler Allgeier, over the course of the last 2 weeks, very little utilization, only 7 rushing attempts in each of those 2 games, far less overall offensive snaps. Cordero Patterson still hasn't returned to the lineup due to his injury and may not return, as Bijan Robinson's dominating, to be honest. In the last 4 games, he's had a minimum of 4 receptions in every single game, and if that's only going to continue behind an elite offensive line who is allowing 4.2 yards before contact per attempt, that means Bijan Robinson's able to get 4 yards before he makes a first contact. This offensive line's playing well. He's extremely elusive, and they're finding a lot of success. Number 4 is Josh Jacobs. Now, against the Los Angeles Chargers, Josh Jacobs very easily could have had a second touchdown early in that game. Obviously, the touchdown was called back. Then Aiden O'Connell on the following play, QB sneaks it into the end zone. He could have very easily had himself a 30-point fantasy game. Unfortunately, was unable to get there. Nonetheless, Aiden O'Connell's overall contributions to help Josh Jacobs get back on track certainly were there. 11 total targets. That's a career high for Josh Jacobs. 8 catches for 81. Hopefully, as we continue, considering the offensive line of the Las Vegas Raiders have been one of the worst in the National Football League. I mentioned just moments ago with Bijan Robinson, yards before contact per attempt was 4.2 for Bijan this season. For Josh Jacobs, it's 1.4 yards. It's absolutely just destructive. This offensive line is really not helping Josh Jacobs in a lot of the situations that he is in, unfortunately. But he's a multifaceted back. He can get it down on the ground and through the air. And as long as he's going to continue to get a high volume of targets going forward, especially going up against the Green Bay Packers, which is an advantageous matchup. We just saw, David Montgomery be able to roll through this team. They're allowing 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the ground, over 4 yards per carry on average. Josh Jacobs should continue his momentum and have himself another great week here. Our number 5 is Saquon Barkley. Again, he had a limited participation of practice all of last week. So the assumption is that, yes, there was a chance for him to play on Monday night, but they wanted to be reserved. They wanted to be safe with that. If Andrew Thomas comes back, Saquon Barkley comes back, this is a completely different team. Now, in the last 2 games without Saquon Barkley in the lineup, we have seen the New York Giants given their running backs in Week 3's contest against the San Francisco 49ers, 8 rushing attempts, 6 targets. Last night's performance against the Seattle Seahawks, 18 rushing attempts, 7 total targets. The last time we saw Saquon Barkley in the lineup, 17 overall rushing attempts and 6 receptions. So pretty much they're staying on pace in terms of the overall running back contributions, whether it's on the ground and through the air. And once Saquon Barkley returns, taking on the Miami Dolphins, regardless of the fact that this may be a blowout and the Miami Dolphins may command a very early lead, Saquon Barkley can still get it done on the ground and through the air. And really his fantasy point output isn't going to be really diminished because of the one-sided affair that this game could potentially end up being if the Miami Dolphins take a commanding lead. I expect, of course, Saquon Barkley to come back healthy and have another successful week here. Number 6 is Tony Pollard. Unfortunately, Tony Pollard's overall opportunities, his snap counts, they all diminished. Only 11 rushing attempts and only 53% of the overall offensive snaps played. Well, it shouldn't really be a surprise considering that game was 30-0 very quickly, as Mac Jones obviously turned over the ball a couple times, a couple defensive touchdowns from the Dallas Cowboys, and all was history. But the biggest difference maker as to whether or not Tony Pollard goes from scoring 7 fantasy points like he did last week to potentially scoring 20 is a matter of whether or not this team is going to find success in the red zone. We've talked about it for the last 3 consecutive weeks. The Dallas Cowboys have been awful in the red zone. Specifically, Tony Pollard leads all players in the National Football League in red zone rushing attempts. And unfortunately, the Dallas Cowboys in the last 3 weeks have been 4 for 15 in the red zone. And in terms of goal-to-go situations, are 3 for 9. This offense has been terrible in the red zone and quite frankly could have won last week's game against Bill Belichick by 40 or 50 points if in fact they were able to at least put something together within the red zone. Tony Pollard should be fine going up against the San Francisco 49ers this week. Has himself a little bit of a revenge game considering obviously the injury that he sustained in the NFL playoffs against that team. Obviously, as soon as Pollard came out of the game, the entire dynamic of that entire offense of the Cowboys changed and the chances of winning that game really dipped. Hopefully Tony Pollard can get back on track and of course prove to the 49ers that he is the difference maker for this Cowboys team. Our number 7 is Bijan Robinson Jr. He takes on the Chicago Bears on Thursday Night Football. Yes, it's a short week, but Bijan Robinson Jr. has been incredible this season. The way that Eric Bieniemy has utilized him in comparison to the early offseason, thoughts that perhaps we'd see a lot more Antonio Gibson, that is not the case. And Bijan Robinson Jr. has been able to consistently put up greater volume of points, obviously because he's getting a great volume of opportunity. In 3 of the games this season in which they've been competitive, obviously not counting the game against the Buffalo Bills where they got blown out, he's been given a minimum of 16 total touches per game in those 3 contests. He's been able to at least score 1 touchdown in each of those 3 games. And even last week against the Philadelphia Eagles, even though it was the most difficult matchup at the position, was still extremely successful, scored himself double-digit fantasy points, and could have had himself a second rushing touchdown if it wasn't for the fact that he fumbled the ball on the 1-yard line and it was recovered by Terry McLaurin in the end zone. I'm expecting this Bears defense that has been awful all season on a short week dealing with injuries to have themselves their hands full with Bijan Robinson running between the tackles and finding himself a lot of fantasy success. Moving on to our number 8, David Montgomery. Man, David Montgomery was used like a workhorse back to say the very least. Obviously coming off of the injury on a short week on Thursday night, dominated against the division rival in the Green Bay Packers. And regardless of the fact, it is apparent that he is the Jamal Williams of this team. If it wasn't apparent week 1, week 2, in the offseason, it is now abundantly clear for those of you who are wondering whether or not this guy is going to be taking that Jamal Williams role. Yes, this team loves to use a power back, and they're going to continue to do so behind this incredibly elite offensive line. In terms of overall rushing attempts in weeks 1, 2, and 4, the games in which Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery have both been active, David Montgomery outtouches Jahmyr Gibbs in terms of rushing attempts 69-22. It's a one-sided affair. And at a base minimum, David Montgomery this season has been able to put up 67 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown in each of the 3 games that he's participated in. Fantastic. He has an opportunity going up against the second best matchup at the position, a team that is nearly allowing 5 yards per carry to opposing running backs and nearly 21 fantasy points per game on average in terms of rushing statistics alone. This should be a great game for David Montgomery. Moving on to Kyren Williams. Even though he has one of the more difficult matchups, like I mentioned on Sunday morning, Kyren Williams has some of the highest upside for touchdowns amongst all running backs in the National Football League. There is a reason he he has scored 6 touchdowns already, and he's tied for number 3 amongst all running backs in the National Football League in terms of total touchdowns scored. Regardless of the fact that Matthew Stafford and Puka Nacua are cleaning it up through the air, they continue to get down into the red zone and allow Kyren Williams to find success. He had 28 total touches against the Indianapolis Colts, was easily able to score 2 touchdowns early in that game. And again, once they get down into the red zone, amongst all players in the National Football League, he's number 3 in terms of rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. He has 5 rushing attempts for 4 rushing touchdowns in that overall category, a minimum of 17 total opportunities in each of the games he has played this season. Even though it is a difficult matchup technically against the Eagles, we just saw a guy like Bijan Robinson Jr. find success. I expect Kyren Williams, if healthy and that hip injury is able to heal up, to be perfectly fine in the matchup. Moving on to our number 10, Achane. Achane is the real deal. I mean, at this point, considering the fact that he not only outsnapped, but he outtouched Raheem Mostert and was able to get the red zone utilization within this offense, it just seems to me like Mike McDaniel is going to continue to use this younger running back that he knows is far more capable going forward. And even with the return of Jeff Wilson Jr. potentially looming this week, Achane is a must start. You have to play him at this current capacity. I mean, he was able to outsnap Raheem Mostert by 11 total snaps and outtouch him by 1 total touch. The first touchdown that Achane had, originally, the prior play was a jet sweep that he motioned. They kind of tossed it forward. He ran, and they got pretty close to the goal line, inside the 5-yard line. The following play lined up with Achane out of the backfield. Raheem Mostert was not on the field, and they just plugged it in and scored an immediate touchdown. The following play in which he scored a touchdown, a jet sweep, in which this young man was able to get himself out of the backfield. Once again, they're getting him pretty much a full head of steam, then handing him off the ball. And when you have 4.340 speed, of course, you're going to be able to find the end zone. So again, they scored again, even with whether it's Tua Tagovailoa under center or in the shotgun with these jet sweeps. They're going to continue to utilize this going forward. They take on the New York Giants this week, one of the most advantageous matchups at the position. And as you can tell from his rushing, log, everything he does, every time he touches the ball, he finds himself a lot of success. Moving on to our number 11, we have DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift's been able to get the job done. I mean, again, even though they're limiting his overall utilization, his snaps, he is still getting himself a lot of touches. A total of 18 touches this last week. Was able to find himself a second rushing touchdown in the last 3 games that he's played. That's relatively rare for Philadelphia Eagles running backs, especially considering that QB sneak is so deadly down in the red zone for Jalen Hurts. Nonetheless, DeAndre Swift, I mean, as of thus far this season, he's clearly the number 1 running back for this team. Now, even though the Philadelphia Eagles are going back and forth, in the first quarter, it'll be all DeAndre Swift. In the second quarter, it's all Kenneth Gainwell. In the third quarter, it's all DeAndre Swift. And fortunately for many of us who have DeAndre Swift, in the fourth quarter, considering this game was very close, he did play the final 3 drives outright, and Kenneth Gainwell did not see the field. But ultimately, they're switching back and forth between him and Gainwell in order to make sure that their running backs are fresh. And honestly, they like Gainwell. So Gainwell is not going anywhere. It's just a matter of, can DeAndre Swift, in the opportunities that he's given, be able to find himself a lot of upside. And thus far this season, we've been able to see him average, over 5 yards per carry at a base minimum. And he's been able to go against, again, pretty tough defenses in terms of run stopping. The physicality of the Washington Commanders run stop defense should not be undersold. They've got a pretty good run stop defense, but behind an incredible offensive line, I don't care who you're playing up against, especially going up against the LA Rams this week. I'm expecting DeAndre Swift to have himself another incredible game. And of course, double-digit production, hopefully finds himself in the end zone. Our number 12 is Alvin Kamara. My goodness, Alvin Kamara played 75% of the offensive snaps and had quite literally 24 touches in his first game back from his suspension. Obviously, 14 targets, 13 receptions for 33 yards was the biggest surprising number. I did not expect Derek Carr to target him and pepper him with so many overall targets. Obviously, Derek Carr was coming off of that shoulder injury, the AC sprain. Maybe that was affecting his ability to throw the ball downfield, and he just continued to check it down to Alvin Kamara. Nonetheless, a couple statistics regarding this. 13 receptions for Alvin Kamara is the second most receptions he's ever had in a single game in his career. Obviously, he's had more in the past with Drew Brees. Again, that was the check down king of fantasy football. But in terms of having 13 receptions amongst all players in NFL history, to have 13 receptions in a singular game, 33 receiving yards is the fewest amongst all players. I think the second fewest, or the former fewest, used to be like 81 receiving yards. The only other time that Alvin Kamara's had like 13 or 14 catches, he's always had over 100 receiving yards in those games. So even though the receiving upside of yardage wasn't there, the fact that he is seeing targets and he's getting himself the majority of the rushing work. Tony Jones Jr. seems to be the RB2 and Kendre Miller is still the RB3 within his team. So there really isn't that much of an impeding opportunity of a rookie running back really digging into the work of Alvin Kamara. And the fact that Derek Carr, going back to last season, in the 15 games that he started for the Las Vegas Raiders, he targeted his running backs about 6.3 times per game. If those targets continue to stay in line and Alvin Kamara continues to find himself open, he's going to be extremely valuable for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 13 in the final of the C tier, we have Aaron Jones. Last week, Aaron Jones was on a snap count, on a pitch count. And obviously, this was a one-sided affair in which they had to throw the ball for a majority of the second half. So why have Aaron Jones on the field when you're limiting him? We know what his potential is. We saw it in week 1. And the fact that this offense has played as well as they have in terms of touchdown upside, it'll continue to give Aaron Jones more upside for not only receiving work, but of course, finding himself in the end zone, which really has been his bread and butter throughout his entire career. And the worry this offseason was, without Aaron Rodgers within the lineup, is there a potential for this team to continue to score enough fantasy points and score enough touchdowns from their prospects if, in fact, the offense isn't up to par? Obviously, it has been, and going forward should be a great matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders. The biggest issue with Aaron Jones this week, and the reason why I have him a little bit lower at number 13 primarily is the fact that 3 of his starting linemen are hurt. David Bakhtiari, Jenkins, and of course Runyon. Those 3 guys obviously could end up missing. We know Bakhtiari is on the injured reserve, but the other 2, if they end up missing, certainly will damage the overall upside of Aaron Jones within the given week. Moving on to James Conner, our number 14. Again, James Conner has played very well, and so have the Arizona Cardinals. Thus far this season, in every single individual game, James Conner has been able to average over 4 yards per carry. In my mind, that really was not expected prior to getting into the season. I know that they made some adjustments to their offensive line, bringing in free agents, obviously drafting an offensive lineman in the first round of the NFL draft. Those are certainly, difference makers. But the fact that this offense has been so potent with Joshua Dobbs, and they're only continuing to improve every single week, leads me to believe that James Conner is going to continue to find himself success. From weeks 1 through 3, prior to the San Francisco 49ers game in week 4, he was able to get himself 16 touches minimum. Obviously, the 49ers game got out of hand and they had to throw for a majority of the second half, which obviously did not lend to James Conner finding himself a lot of upside. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals this week at home. I'm expecting a lot of success from this offense, and considering how bad the Bengals have been and the fact that their defense gave up 27 points to the Titans, I'm expecting James Conner to have himself another big week here. Moving on to our number 15. Another consecutive week in London, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars and Travis Etienne. They take on the Buffalo Bills in London. The expectation is that if, in fact, the jet lag is going to hit, there may be a chance for the Jaguars. Otherwise, the Buffalo Bills have been on such a hot streak. It's just going to be a matter of, can Travis Etienne find the end zone early enough? Because we know he's going to get the touches. That's a given. Thus far this season, his overall volume of touches, 23, 14, 23, and 23. He's number 4 amongst all running backs in terms of overall rushing attempts. So then we know that the volume is going to be there. But can he fall into the end zone? He's going to get the receiving work. That's a given. That's happened every single week. And the matchup against the Bills is not bad at all. They're allowing 5.98 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs. That's the highest average in the league thus far. If you want to succeed against the Bills, keep the ball out of Josh Allen's hands and run the ball consistently. Hopefully, Doug Peterson is going to be able to employ that, because if he's able to, Travis Etienne getting the rushing work, the receiving work, and potentially finding the end zone should be a fantastic play as an RB2. Moving on to James Cook on the other end of this matchup. Of course, the issue with James Cook primarily is the fact that he is not going to consistently score touchdowns for this team. Thus far this season, inside the 10-yard line, of the 5 touchdowns that this team has scored in terms of rushing, 2 of them going to Latavius Murray, 1 of them going to Dameon Harris, 1 of them going to Josh Allen. And of course, luckily, James Cook was able to find the end zone this last week, having himself a rushing touchdown. Outside of that, very seldom will get the ball inside the 10-yard line. But hopefully they spread the love a little bit more and get James Cook more involved in terms of touchdown upside, because truly that is the difference maker as to whether or not he's going to have okay weeks to have himself incredible performances. Now, obviously, in the last couple weeks, we haven't seen a lot of overall touches from James Cook to the point to where we're like super excited about his overall volume of opportunity, because we've continued to see more and more utilization out of Dameon Harris and Latavius Murray, primarily because they're just blowing out a lot of teams. They blew out the Las Vegas Raiders, then subsequently after the Washington Commanders, and then they pretty much pulled away in the second half of that game against the Miami Dolphins, which really didn't lead to James Cook having to run the ball as much as guys like Latavius Murray and Dameon Harris getting themselves rushing attempts in the second half. Hopefully this will be a closer game, and if so, James Cook should find himself a lot of success. Bijan Robinson just tore up this defense. Why not James Cook? Moving on to Joe Mixon, our number 17. This offense is ranked 31 amongst all teams in total rushing yards thus far this season. On top of that statistic, they're number 32 amongst all teams in total yardage. This is the worst offense in the National Football League. And unfortunately, that is the case because of the fact that Joe Burrow is injured. I mean, Joe Mixon's played very well this season. In terms of efficiency, you go back to 2022, you look at his numbers, they were not great. Thus far this season, I mean, he's coming off of a week in which he was averaging 4.8 yards per carry against the Tennessee Titans defense. Again, we know how incredible they have been in terms of stopping the run. Yet Mixon and this offensive line, they have played very well. And I'm hoping Mixon can have himself a Christian McCaffrey game where he can run the ball a bunch of times and score himself a lot of fantasy points, regardless of what the heck Joe Burrow is doing within this offense. But unfortunately, that's not the reality of the situation. Joe Burrow is very immobile. Teams know that if they go ahead and stack the box early and then rush the passer and blitz him in the second, third downs when they know that they have to throw because it's second and long, third and long. Of course, they're going to continue to get to the quarterback and force a lot of discomfort within this offense. The hope is that Joe Burrow can get healthy very quickly, because if he's not able to, Joe Mixon's not going to find himself in the red zone. And if he's not going to find himself in the red zone, he's not going to score in the end zone, unfortunately. Despite how great the matchup is, it's tough for Joe Mixon considering all the variables within that offense. Moving on to our number 18, we have Isiah Pacheco. Pacheco in the last 2 consecutive games has found himself a lot of success, to say the very least. Again, having yourself a high volume of opportunity at the running back position is one of the biggest determining factors as to whether or not you're going to score points. Again, the biggest factor of scoring more points is just more touches. That's just a given. So when he's had 17 total touches in week 3, 23 in week 4, and it's only continuing to grow in terms of the receiving work, that receiving upside growing, especially something that we didn't see late last season when Clyde Edwards-Helaire was out. I'm expecting Isiah Pacheco to continue to grow within this offense. They take on the Minnesota Vikings. They have a pretty good run-stopping defense. Outside of playing against the Philadelphia Eagles, obviously on that short week in which they were dealing with injuries, and, of course, DeAndre Swift cut him up for 175. Outside of that given game, they've been pretty good in terms of stopping the run against all teams this season. So I don't think it's really going to change. I think they're going to be a pretty tough matchup, but nonetheless, Isiah Pacheco has been playing very well. He's got himself a high volume of opportunity, and considering we're going to be in a situation where most likely Patrick Mahomes and this passing attack take advantage of the secondary early, they should be running the ball for majority of the second half, which will lead to a lot of fantasy success for Pacheco. Now, before we get into our number 19, a couple reminders for those of you guys who haven't checked out the 1.01 brand, the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. Be sure to go ahead and check out the link down in the description, andrewkirchhoffshop.com. Again, thanks to all of you guys' incredible support regarding the merch and repping the greetings and salutations, the 1.01 brand. Again, I'm happy to announce that we are offering free shipping for the remainder of the season. So for those of you who are interested, of course, supporting the channel, repping the brand, finding yourself high quality, of course, comfortable and stylish clothing for the remainder of the 2023 season, be sure to check out the link down in the description. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our number 19. We have Dameon Pierce of the Houston Texans. Dameon Pierce has primarily benefited from the fact that, of course, this offense as a passing attack has been incredible. Typically, offenses want to go ahead and use the running game in order to set up the pass with play action. But instead, the passing game for the Houston Texans is setting up the running game for Dameon Pierce and allowing him to find a lot of success. 10 plus fantasy points in each of the last 2 games. He's been incredible in those overall opportunities. 24 rushing attempts and had himself 1 reception this last week. 25 touches is no joke. But obviously, we've seen a progression in terms of his overall rushing statistics, going from 38 rushing yards, 31, 31, and most recently against the Pittsburgh Steelers in a tough matchup, 81 rushing yards. Incredible. This upcoming week, Titus Howard, their starting right tackle, should be coming off the injured reserve. And the following week, their starting center, second-round pick, Juice Scruggs, should be coming off the injured reserve as well. This offense is only going to continue to build momentum. And if they get their offensive line back, my goodness, Dameon Pierce is going to be a handful for defenses. Moving on to our number 20, we have Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert, again, was outshined by Achane. And of course, we have Jeff Wilson looming to potentially return. My biggest issue here is, of course, the fact that Achane outsnapped him and outtouched him and got majority of the red zone utilization. And that is the biggest kiss of death that I could possibly foresee. Going forward, it's going to be tough. Luckily, they do have an advantageous matchup against the New York Giants. The Giants are giving up 19 fantasy points per game and over 4.3 yards per carry on average to opposing running backs thus far this season on average. And of course, we have seen Raheem Mostert in the last 2 weeks have himself 12 total targets and I think, 10 receptions out of the backfield. The receiving upside's there. If the goal line upside rears its head out, and of course, he can find himself in the end zone, fantastic. And especially if this is going to be a blowout game, he could see more rushing attempts in the second half in order to kill the clock, which will only make him more valuable. Fingers crossed that he gets to be viable for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 21, we have Breece Hall. This is a revenge game, not only for Nathaniel Hackett because of the fact that, Sean Payton had those choice words this offseason, but because Breece Hall last season, I think it was week 7, was having an incredible game against the Denver Broncos. And then he tore his ACL. This is kind of the full circle. We get back to this point against the Broncos It's a revenge game. The team's fired up, trying to, of course, prove that the Jets still are a formidable team. They proved that on Sunday Night Football. They were very competitive in that game. And even though we haven't seen very many rushing attempts from Breece Hall in the last 3 weeks, 4 rushing attempts, 12 and 6, he can hopefully get back on track, fresh legs, and have himself a dominant performance in a revenge game. Again, the Denver Broncos are the easiest matchup at the running back position. And for those of you who say, well, it was majority of the Miami Dolphins contributions that led to that overall standing. Well, in that case, somebody explained to me why Khalil Herbert, of all running backs, just ran for 18 attempts and 100 rushing yards against that defense. There's a lot of upside within the matchup, and hopefully Breece Hall will be able to actualize it and get back on track. Moving on, we have our number 22, Rhamondre Stevenson. We had a report on Sunday morning that many of you guys were relaying to me saying, hey, Andrew, Ian Rappaport is saying that Zeke is going to get quote-unquote starter reps and touches in the given game against the Cowboys. I told you guys, reports like that are unsubstantiated. They can only be taken at face value, and they really can't be just taken and immediately utilized for fantasy purposes. And even though Rhamondre Stevenson didn't have a great game, we could all tell that Zeke wasn't getting rushing attempts and getting quote-unquote starter reps. The fact of the matter is, Rhamondre Stevenson is the clear number 1, but unfortunately has not been relevant because the offense sucks. They're not scoring touchdowns. And on top of it, he is not seeing receiving upside, even in negative game script games. In the last 4 weeks, he's gone from ranking as RB19, RB17, RB31, and RB40 in each individual week. Overall, he's only sliding downhill. And hopefully, if this offense can find their footing against the New Orleans Saints, by all means, we'd love to see Rhamondre Stevenson find himself fantasy success, considering the investment we made on his overall potential. But it's been rough as of late. Therefore, he sits as a low-end RB2. I mean, just Mac Jones got to play better. And eventually, Rhamondre Stevenson will find himself in the end zone. Moving on to our number 23, we have Alexander Mattison. Each of the last 2 weeks, he's been able to surpass over 90 rushing yards. This team is continuing to find their footing in the running game. Obviously, signing Dalton Risner a couple weeks back certainly has helped for their interior offensive line, and it's only going to continue. It's just a matter of Cam Akers going to get himself more of a rushing role within this offense. I doubt that's going to be the case. Again, this last week, Mattison had 17 rushing attempts, 1 catch. We saw Cam Akers with only 4 rushing attempts. This is going to be Alexander Madison's backfield. Obviously, the matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs could be an advantageous one if, in fact, they keep the matchup close. If this is going to be a game in which this team's trying to roar back from a deficit, of course, Kirk Cousins is going to have to cook with his receivers. But, of course, we know that Alexander Mattison is certainly more capable than Cam Akers in the receiving game and will certainly be able to benefit from that and hopefully find the end zone. Moving on to our number 24 is Jahmyr Gibbs. I mean, again, are we surprised that they're using David Montgomery identically to the way that they used Jamal Williams? Are we surprised that they're using Jahmyr Gibbs in a limited capacity similar to the way that they did with DeAndre Swift last year? No, we are not surprised. Therefore, going forward, we just have to utilize Jahmyr Gibbs very sparingly in a half PPR. In a full PPR, he could have more value in games in which he's getting more receptions. But going into the matchup against the Carolina Panthers, the second easiest matchup in terms of running back rushing statistics allowed, when we are only seeing Jahmyr Gibbs getting himself, 7 to 8 overall rushing attempts per game when David Montgomery's active, when we're only seeing that kind of overall contribution. And we've only seen Jahmyr Gibbs finish as the number 36, 24, and 29 overall running back this season in individual weeks in a half PPR. The best week he has had was RB23 in week 3, in which Montgomery wasn't even active. He still wasn't able to get into the top 12 capacity. If he's not going to get the touchdown upside, if he's going to get limited touches, again, not the best play within a given week. Moving on to our number 25, we have Zach Moss. So the entire conversation regarding Zach Moss and why he sits at number 25 is mainly a matter of, can we get more clarity on whether or not Jonathan Taylor is playing? Now, speaking of Jonathan Taylor, as you guys can see from the chart alone, Zach Moss has been very efficient. I mean, for those of us who have had him on roster, if he scores a touchdown, this guy is a easy top 15 back every single week. But the question is Jonathan Taylor going to be active? I have Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss at number 25 and number 26 because I don't know whether or not Jonathan Taylor is going to play this week. I don't know if they're going to be able to utilize him and what capacity they're going to split at, 50-50, 70-30. I have no clue. If Jonathan Taylor does not play, Zach Moss is easily in the top 16 conversation at the running back position, taking on the Tennessee Titans, despite how difficult that matchup is within the given week. Nonetheless, we have a lot of information that is still not available to us and the public. We're going to have to wait and see whether or not Jonathan Taylor practicing today and going forward means that he will be suiting up for the Indianapolis Colts this season, and how much of a capacity of usage we're going to see Zach Moss, of course, attribute to Jonathan Taylor with him splitting the backfield going forward, if that's going to take place. Moving on to our number 27, we have Khalil Herbert. Like I mentioned, Khalil Herbert tore apart that Denver Broncos defense. Again, they give up a lot of rushing yards, and just by the rushing attempts that you guys can see on screen, he had himself a lot of success. 18 carries for 103 rushing yards, and quite honestly, even before the Sunday game, we had a report that many of you during the Sunday live stream were relaying to me saying, hey, Andrew, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN is saying that Roschon Johnson is going to see an enhanced role. And like I told you guys, same with the Ezekiel Elliott reports that were coming out with him getting starter reps. These are reports that are unsubstantiated. We cannot take them outside of just face value. We cannot put them into actual kind of usage until we actually get proof. And obviously, there was no proof. This was a all Khalil Herbert game. 18 carries, 4 catches on 5 targets, a receiving touchdown, an incredible 20-point performance. This is the Khalil Herbert. This is the Justin Fields offense that we know is very much so capable of existing for the remainder of the season. And honestly, the fact that we saw Khalil Herbert play 78% of the overall snaps, 56 total snaps in week 4. In weeks 2 and 3, he had a combined total of 60 snaps. There is a huge shift within this offense, and hopefully they're going to continue to grow. The streak continues for Khalil Herbert. I mentioned it all offseason when we talked about Herbert. In games throughout his entire career, from 2021 through 2022, anytime he's given 13 or more touches, he's averaging 15.11 fantasy points per game. This last week, of course, had over 13 touches and obviously had himself a lot more fantasy points than 15, but continues that streak of when you give this man opportunity, he's going to find success, because from weeks 1 through 3, his overall touches were 12, 8, and 9. Give this man touches, he'll find success. It should be an advantageous matchup going up against the Washington Commanders. Last season, against this defense, we saw the Chicago Bears running backs combined for 22 carries and 141 rushing yards. Specifically, Khalil Herbert had himself 7 carries for 74 in that matchup. We're hoping for another big week from Khalil Herbert. Moving on to our number 28, we have Gus Edwards. He is clearing away the number 1 running back of this team. He played 69% of the snaps. He had 15 rushing attempts, while Melvin Gordon and Justice Hill each individually had 3 rushing attempts within their own overall opportunities. As a whole, we're going to continue to see Gus Edwards be the RB1. It's just a matter of, can he still be viable for fantasy purposes if every single week Lamar Jackson is scoring 2 rushing touchdowns? The answer is obviously no, but the fact that he's getting 71% of the overall rushing attempts within this backfield and 75% of the overall running back targets out of this backfield, that is incredible. Inside the 10-yard line, he only has 1 rushing attempt for 1 rushing touchdown this season. Lamar Jackson has 5 for 4 touchdowns. That's the biggest difference maker, but it should be a one-sided affair against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We got to hope he finds himself in the end zone. Moving on to our number 29, Jaleel McLaughlin. Like I mentioned in yesterday's waiver wire pickup episode, he can be viable. It's just a matter of whether or not this offense is going to be able to find their footing and whether they're going to utilize him more often than Samaje Perine. That is the expectation. We don't know. Maybe Javonte Williams ends up playing this week, ranking subject to change. But as you can tell, Jaleel McLaughlin, with his overall opportunities against the Bears defense, was able to find himself a lot of success. It's just a matter of going forward, can we potentially find enough opportunity to justify starting him? And luckily for Jaleel McLaughlin, there have been running backs in each of the last 3 games against the Jets that have been able to surpass 72 or more rushing yards. So hopefully, with ample opportunity, whether it's on the ground and through the air, in this offense, there should be a lot of success for McLaughlin to be had. Moving on to Miles Sanders at number 30. He's dealing with a groin injury. They take on the Detroit Lions. Like I mentioned last week with Aaron Jones, since week 11 of the 2022 season, the Detroit Lions have allowed less than 82 rushing yards to opposing running backs in 11 of their 12 games. They've allowed 60 or fewer rushing yards to opposing running backs in 8 of their last 12 games. Pacheco this season with 23 rushing yards. Kenneth Walker with 43 rushing yards. Bijan Robinson with 33 rushing yards. And Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon combined for 29 rushing yards. Miles Sanders, good luck. Moving on to our number 31, we have Najee Harris, who finally had himself a little bit of success in terms of breaking out some big runs in an advantageous matchup. Unfortunately, goes into a week in which the offense is injured, whether it's Kenny Pickett, Pat Freiermuth, and also, again, it's probably not a great matchup going up against the Baltimore Ravens run-stop defense when your offensive line is playing as bad as they are. Najee Harris has not been terrible this season. In fact, when you compare his overall yards per carry, yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt, explosive runs per attempt, all of those metrics, he is hitting career highs in all 4 of those categories in comparison to the last 2 seasons, 2021 and 2022. So ultimately, Najee Harris is playing far better than he has in the past, even though people say he's slow, he's not playing well. He has been far more efficient than he's ever been. It's purely just a matter of, can Najee Harris be included within an offense that is going to get him rushing touchdowns? And unfortunately, it's not going to be the case because this offense sucks. And that's just the cold, hard truth. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Steelers do not have a single red zone rushing attempt inside the 5-yard line this season. When you don't have opportunities in the red zone at a high capacity and you're having to throw the ball in order to find touchdowns and not even get into the red zone, Of course, Najee Harris and his overall upside is diminished. Moving on to our number 32, we have Tyjae Spears. Again, he has been able to get himself 8 touches in each of the last 3 games. If he continues to see this kind of overall opportunity in the last 2 games that the Titans have won, specifically against the Chargers and this last week against the Bengals, he's finished as the number 33 RB and number 28 RB, scoring 6.5 and 7.3 fantasy points in a half PPR. Again, playing 53% of the offensive snaps is great. If he's on the field, he's getting touches, he has upside. Moving on to our number 33, we have Jaylen Warren. Again, Jaylen Warren in the last 4 weeks has finished as RB 46, RB 21, RB 32, and RB 23. Specifically, he's been able to get himself 3 receptions minimum in each of the last 4 games. And as long as this offense is going to be in a negative game script against the Baltimore Ravens, expect for them to throw the ball for the majority of the game. Mitchell Trubisky is not afraid of checking it down to his running backs. You go back to the days of Pittsburgh last year, or even go back to the days of Chicago with David Montgomery, Tariq Cohen. He loves to check it down. And hopefully Jaylen Warren will be that guy in the given week for him.Moving on to our number 34, Samaje Perine. If the Jets defense, who has not been able to stop opposing running backs thus far this season at a higher capacity than we anticipated, if they're going to continue to struggle in that category, Samaje Perine could be of value. But it's just a matter of, does the Jets offense keep the Denver Broncos in this game? And if they do, Samaje Perine could have value. Outside of that, really, he's probably like a 5 to 6 point fantasy play. And that's pretty much what RB34 kind of is within the current capacity. Moving on to our number 35, we have Kenneth Gainwell. Considering him and Swift continue to swap every series, every quarter, and there's obviously a conscious effort to use both these running backs, obviously Kenneth Gainwell is going to get touches. As to whether he's going to be valuable or not, he's not going to get rushing touchdowns. He's very seldom going to have super high upside weeks considering his rushing efficiency is not there. He's primarily been used in the past as a receiving back, and that's really what he is. Outside of that, you're going to need a couple big runs for him to find value. Moving on to the final option. Speaking of needing something, the need for Tyler Allgeier to get himself a rushing touchdown is beyond, comfort at this point. Tyler Allgeier has had 7 rushing attempts in each of the last 2 weeks. He's been highly inefficient. And because of that, even though he's been behind an elite offensive line, he has seen less and less opportunities because if he's not going to be efficient, why not just give those touches to Bijan Robinson? Tyler Allgeier is our number 36 because really there aren't really many other running backs considering all the bye weeks that we're dealing with. Again, we currently have the Los Angeles Chargers, so no Eckler, the Cleveland Browns, so no Jerome Ford, the Seattle Seahawks, so no Kenneth Walker, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so no Rachaad White. The running back position is pretty thin, and therefore Tyler Allgeier sits at number 36. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have not yet already and you greatly appreciate the content, the information, and all that I develop over the course of the 2023 season, be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Use code Andrew to support the channel. Get yourself those rankings every single Sunday morning. Play the Pick'ems game. Of course, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. Get that deposit match. And of course, get to playing responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. Outside of that, we'll be back tomorrow with wide receiver rankings for week 5. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.